Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. Welcome to part 2 of Classical Greece. Let me just warn you, there are a number of things here that are not in the book, so you're going to need to have notes out and ready to take those down. Also, there's just quite a lot here, so I'm going to have to go pretty quickly. Please feel free to pause the video on slides that seem to have a lot of words if you feel like you're getting lost. And also, you can go back and rewatch sections of the video and message me if you have any questions at the end and you just don't quite understand. But at this point, let's go ahead and dig on in and see where we can get to. All right, now let's keep in mind, this is a time right after the Persian Wars, really dominated by a man named Pericles. And even though it's the 5th century democracy and every single citizen has exactly the same rights, it's through his rhetoric, it's through his skill in being able to convince his fellow citizens to listen to him, to think along with him, to be persuaded by him, that really gives him power. He doesn't have an elected position. I mean, later he's elected strategos or general, but that's after he's very influential already, right? So, and it's a time right after the Persian Wars when Athens is far and beyond ahead of all of the Greeks in prestige. They are building up their league. They, they need to rebuild their city, and it's under the influence and the encouragement, really, of Pericles that a huge explosion of creativity happens, but also this political situation that's going to be dangerous for Greece. So, or for Athens in particular, I mean to say. So let's go ahead and take a look at those things. Right now, the Delian League, as we see here in the map, is reflected by these gold and these blue areas. And of course, a lot of it's an area we don't even think of as Greece. It's the whole Aegean coastline, right? Except for this red area, which is Sparta and its direct territories, and the pinker area of Peloponnesian League. And let's keep in mind, Athens is the big dog at this point, but Sparta had always been the dominant military force before. And so Sparta is threatened by the existence of and the widespread power of the Delian League. And that's going to brew war by the end of the chapter. Right? But in the meanwhile, the Delian League is going strong. They're gathering under the leadership of Athens, ships and money to defend against any future attacks from the Persians. And Athens thinks, well, okay, and some of that money ought to go back to rebuild our city. We had to sacrifice our city to defend ourselves and all of Greece. So some of those funds should help rebuild our polis. And that makes sense to the Athenians, not as much to their allies, right? Especially as time goes on and the Persians don't reattack. And so some of these Delian allies decide that they want to start leaving the league and they don't like the way that Athens is running things. But the Athenians don't want to get left holding the bag, right? So it brews tension inside the league and a definite tension against the threat that poses to Sparta, right? That's boiling in the background. But meanwhile, the Athenians have a lot of money to spend on rebuilding and aggrandizing their polis, and that really helps fuel and fund a lot of the creativity coming. Now, one thing the book doesn't cover, and we need to cover, is the 3 classical orders. Simply put, they're called Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And you have images from them. They're in your study sheet, and the images are on the bottom of the study sheet, right? And they're all 3 classical architecture, but the differences, right? There's some differences about the style of the column, the style of what comes up on top of the columns, right? We don't have to get into all of those. The easiest way to see the differences is looking at it's called the capital, the tops of each column, and we're going to touch on that in better detail in a second. But you need to get this down, because from here on out, you should be able to look at any classical or look in DC, lots of neoclassical architecture, and see immediately what order of architecture they're using just by looking at their columns. Right? One thing we do need to talk about is the columns themselves. They're typically fluted, and that means that they have these grooves carved out of them that produce vertical lines. And the way they do that is they take the sections. See, the column is not a single stone, it's sections put together. And by the way, put together without mortar. That way they don't have any kind of clunky lines there. It's all smoothly put together, and until they become more ruinous like this, you almost wouldn't see the connection lines. The only thing holding them together are these pegs, right, in these holes in this different sections. But they get the flutes by carving out sections all along the perimeter of each portion of the column, and it produces a very kind of elegant line to look. There's another thing not mentioned here called entasis, E-N-T-A-S-I-S, where the column is thinner at the top, and it widens a bit as it gets to about 2/3 of the way down, and then typically starts to narrow down again. Now, Doric doesn't do that as much. It tends to keep flaring. But this also gives what otherwise might be kind of a clunky image more grace, and therefore more grandeur. If you're looking at the three orders, like I said, the easiest way to tell the difference is to look at the capitals of the columns, right? The capitals of the Doric are going to be simple, plain, unadorned, strong. The columns themselves are going to be thicker and beefier, a little bit shorter, right? And it's much like the Dorians, right? And their descendants in Sparta, masculine, unadorned, forceful. And this is considered the masculine order. Whereas the Ionic order tends to have taller, skinnier columns, but its capitals have scrolls. Now keep in mind, these Ionic writers we were talking about, when they're writing their books, a book in the ancient world is a scroll, right? So the fact that you have scrolls on top, which I believe is a coincidence, still it's a good memory tool to remember the scroll, like Ionic writers, Ionic capitals, right? The third here is the Corinthian order. And this came from a Greek artist who was passing a cemetery and saw a basket of food left at the cemetery. Instead of leaving flowers, they would often leave grave goods, sort of a gift to the spirit of the recently dead, and to keep keep them from wandering. And this basket had a plant growing up from underneath it, and that was the acanthus plant. You see the name of the leaves down here, right? The leaves of the acanthus plant were growing up and then kind of following the basket and then kind of curling down at their tips. And he thought it was such a graceful image that he ended up creating a whole new architectural language or order out of that image. And so that's where you get the Corinthian columns from. And so once you know what these are, that's the easiest way to notice what you're seeing in a classical or a neoclassical building, what order of architecture. And take a look next time, your DC or even just images, since we can't go down there ourselves today. And you'll start seeing it everywhere. Right. Now, the most famous building, of course, and the biggest Greek temple ever made was the Parthenon. And you might wonder, why is it called that? Well, her name really was Athena Parthenos. Most of the major Greek gods and goddesses had sort of secondary names, and it would usually indicate some kind of forceful character they defeated in the past, right? So at any rate, Athena Parthenos has a temple called the Parthenon here in Athens, a city named after her, right? And unlike what we tend to think of classical buildings looking like, they tended to color theirs. They weren't shy at all about painting their beautiful naturalistic sculptures with vivid colors, and painting other sections of the architecture in the same way, right? Now, you might wonder, why is it such a ruinous condition? Well, a few hundred years ago, when the Venetians, the men of Venice, who ruled the waves in at least the eastern half of the Mediterranean, were fighting the Turks who were holding Athens, and the Turks were using the Parthenon as an ammunition station, and so it was blown up in that war, right? And that's one of the reasons for the really ruinous condition. And a lot of the artwork as well, these statues and carvings that were built as part of the Parthenon, have been since kind of taken and preserved, but in places as far away as London, right, like the Elgin marbles, right, which is a point of contention for the Greeks. They want the marbles back, and the British won't send it back. But it's even in a ruinous state, it's still one of the grandest Greek temples, right? And of all Greek classical architecture, it's the premier example. Right? Also on the Athenian Acropolis, you have the Erechtheum, or as you'll sometimes see, Erechtheon. And what's really famous about this building is its porch. And it's a small section of the building. But in this porch, you have these very unusual columns called caryatids, kind of part maiden, part column. And you even see it in the drapery of their dresses, that they start looking like the fluting of columns. Right? All of they're different. Each of these statues is different. It's not quite the same. They're not perfect replicas of each other. But you see that kind of dress folding, imitating fluting. Right? And so even, in lots of neoclassical architecture, they'll occasionally use caryatids, but always sparingly. It's a little too much to have all your columns be like this, especially in a big building. Now, just as a quick look, if you're looking at the Athenian Acropolis as a whole, where are all these places? Well, the easiest one to notice, of course, is the biggest, and that's the Parthenon. Right? But the Erechtheum is this building over here, and the famous porch is just this little section that we see right there. Now, the Propylaea, we've discussed that before. That's the grand entranceway. And here we also have the little temple to Athena Nike, Athena connected to victory. Now, with statuary, the older style, what's called the archaic style of Greek statues, would typically be one of these two, either a kouros statue, a male statue, typically not dressed, because they're usually celebrating an athlete, and athletes competed this way, or a kore statue. The female statues are maidens, and they typically are dressed because they're expected to be more modest, more chaste. But what's noticeable, what we really need to look at here, is their posture. They're really rigid. People don't actually stand this way. I mean, we can clearly tell these are people, but it's not a natural pose. It's a very stylistic, kind of formulated pose. It's not quite as weird looking as Egyptian poses in art, but which are also not natural. But it's still, there's something, less than fully realistic about it, and that's going to change in the classical world. When you see here, two statues, one from Polykleitos, one from Myron, you see this naturalism, and in fact, an idealized naturalism, where everything is in a very careful proportion. The length of this little finger to the hand to the length of the forearm, the whole arm, then to the torso, then the legs. Everything is in proportion, so you can have a small statue or a massive statue, and it's always got this ideal proportion. In fact, it's as if every photograph were automatically, perfectly photoshopped. That's sort of they're trying to depict perfection, and so they perfect whatever they depict. Now, what are they usually carving statues of? Well, it's usually athletes who are seen as an example of perfection, or gods and goddesses who are seen as, by definition, perfect, or almost so. So, what we see here is the naturalism as well. Natural curve in the spine, right? Or this even more curve when you see Myron's discus thrower, right? Actual bends, the way actual bodies actually move like that, particularly in the feet. Notice the stance. You have one leg carrying almost all the weight, right? This other leg's barely just balancing the person. And if you stand comfortably, you're going to put most of your weight on one leg. You could lift the other leg and not move, right? That's the way people actually stand. And therefore, the spine curves to kind of shift and accommodate that weight, rather than perfectly rigid stance like we saw in the archaic statues. Now, among the most famous, really the most famous classical sculptor is Phidias. His statue of Zeus was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. His statue of Athena, which was in the Parthenon, is 40 feet tall, and in its hand it was holding a life-size statue of the goddess of victory, Nike. Right? Now, neither one of these statues still exist. We're told the ancient sources tell us that they were built on a wooden base and covered in gold and ivory to look realistic. And remember, they don't think of the plain white marble as realism. We think of it like that, but they colored their statues. They painted their statues when they were made of marble, right? Or bronze, which is actually more common for the Greeks. So we'll see that in a second, right? Neither one of these statues, as I said, still exist. If you're wondering, why do these people standing by Athena look real? This is a reproduction. There's a reproduction Parthenon built in Nashville, and this is the reproduction of the statue inside of it. So there are people actually standing there. But this one, of course, is an artistic rendition. Right. Now, later classical sculptors like Praxiteles, Lysippus, Scopas, you start getting a little more playfulness. Instead of always serious subjects, sometimes more naturalistic poses, more emotion. Here you see a statue of the god Hermes playing with a little baby Dionysus, who's going to be the god of wine. And so originally the statue was dangling grapes in front of the baby god, right? So playful episodes. Right? But still, this kind of idealized human perfection. Right? And here we see, some of the few bronzes that exist. Most of the Greek bronze originals no longer exist. Ironically, most of the ones we have were at first lost at sea and later recovered. Right? Why? Well, because bronze was such a useful material, most of them got melted down, either and reused half the time for armaments. But you can see in the details of some of these, ivory eyes, copper lips, bronze skin. I mean, we might see a statue looking like this today, but originally the skin parts would have been polished and, the hair treated so that you get this natural coloration. They looked like living tan human beings or godlike human beings. And you can see in the kind of facial expressions here, in this statue, which is only discovered in, I believe, the 80s, there's silver on the teeth and copper on the lips because, like everyone, lips are going to be a little more red than their skin tone. White, ivory in the eyes. The natural posturing. This is a statue of Zeus, or possibly his brother Neptune, casting either a trident if it's Neptune, or a thunderbolt if it's Zeus. But the natural posturing, the natural bends and curves of a real human being, right? And bronze can do this. Most of the statues you've been seeing that are marble are actually Roman copies of the bronze originals. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Hopefully this expands a little bit and helps you understand better. But like I said, message me if you have questions. And I hope you guys have a great Easter break. Take care.